1910. Just a short introduction to that. Now you recall when we concluded the last lecture that we had gotten to the point where Lincoln has poured a lot of resources into supporting this anti-French struggle of the Mexicans that's going on indigenously. One of the generals who fought at the Battle of Cinco de Mayo against the French was named Porfirio Diaz. And in the next 10 years, the Americans got the idea that he was the best one that they could install for their purposes to be the new Mexican president. And so in 1876, he was established as a Mexican president, and that rule over Mexico lasted for 35 years. If you want to see a light portrayal of what was done in Mexico by the American banks and railroads in this period, up until the emergence of Diaz, you want to take a look at the movie called Bandidas with Salma Hayek and Penelope Cruz, which, as I say, is a light comedy, but you do get a good picture of how the U.S. banks and railroads were working in Mexico. Now, Porfirio Diaz was a totally corrupt person, which is why the Americans wanted him to be president of Mexico. And he lasted until 1910, when the country rose up and threw him out. Now, that second revolution in Mexico lasted from 1910 until 1934, almost a quarter of a century. It first comes under the leadership of a man named Plutarco Elias Calles, and it consolidates under the second man that takes his place within the party of the Institutional Revolution, whose name is Lázaro Cárdenas. Cárdenas is the last honest president Mexico ever had, and it hadn't had very many honest ones before that. So Cárdenas, because he was an honest president all his life, and he did what he thought was best for Mexico, and he did a lot for Mexico, including nationalizing oil, is still a revered figure in Mexican history, because there hasn't been an honest president of Mexico since Lázaro Cárdenas. That is, somebody that wasn't on president that wasn't on somebody's payroll. Not all of these were U.S. stooges. The Mexican ruling class was behind Lázaro Cárdenas, or a big part of it was, because they realized that their major competitor was going to be these gringo and British investors in the oil business in Mexico, and they wanted that business for themselves. So there was a lot of support in Mexico among the ruling classes for what the radicals were doing. Nobody was more radical than Plutarco Calles, but he was a Freemason. He's certainly no communist, and a Catholic. He came from one of the wealthier families in Mexico, and so he was exactly the kind of person that could put organized labor behind this movement of the bourgeoisie, native bourgeoisie, against foreign capitalists. Now, these farmers, this mass of Mexican farmers, which you see in movies about Pancho Villa and so on, and dressed in white, and they've got a rifle and they're attacking a train and things like that, these were the troops. There were 4 men that were leading these guys, but at any rate, we'll talk about these in detail in your book, but Pancho Villa had control of the north. Emiliano Zapata had control of the state of Morelos, which is a huge population center just to the south of Mexico City. And John Reed enters the picture at this time. He's the communist that the movie Reds was made about, and it comes from Portland, Oregon. That's where Reed College comes from. He was down there now, and the communists themselves were down there in 1921-22, forming, that is, the Leninists from Russia were down there forming the first Communist Party. So everybody's getting involved in this whole thing in Mexico. In 1915, Calles, who was from the state of Sonora and had this good military background, was pledging allegiance to then the current president named Venustiano Carranza, who was also from Sonora State. And they put together a party called the Party of the Institutional Revolution. The Mexican or the Spanish initials for that are PRI, or they just call it PRI. That party took power in Mexico City from General Obregón. Calles helped Obregón overthrow Carranza in 1920, and 4 years later, Calles took power as president for himself. Now, one of the things about the Freemasons that is important to remember is that they were always at war with the Catholic Church. So when Calles became president in 1924, he began to enforce the 1917 Constitution that stripped the Catholic Church of all of its properties and its monopoly over education, and had in fact de facto outlawed the Catholic Church from getting involved in politics at all in Mexico. Well, there was a reason for this, and that is that the church had always been allied with the most reactionary ruling families in Mexico. So the hatred that they had for these reactionary latifundista hacienda owners was immediately transferred to the Catholic Church, and they really took it right where you don't want to take it from that time forward. Two of the most notorious anti-clerical states were Chiapas and Tabasco. Tabasco is where Villahermosa is, and later on you're going to see I went there as assistant manager for one of the U.S. oil monopolies, oil field service companies, operations in Mexico. But long before that, Graham Greene wrote a book. You know who he is, the British author. His first book, called Another Mexico. Now, at this time, Graham Greene was a militant Catholic. So this book, Another Mexico, gives you an insight into what it was like to be a Catholic priest in Mexico in these Calles years. And they were on the run all the time. Calles hated them. If he could find them, he'd kill them. They dynamited churches, they shot priests and nuns. They forced all of these people either out of the country or into hiding. It was very similar to what happened to the Catholics in England after the Protestant Reformation arrived there. So I would recommend you take a look at that. If you want to take a look at how Mexican Catholics today view what happened to them in that period, there's a movie called For the Greater Glory, which is a really reactionary movie, but it might be worth watching from the standpoint of giving you an idea of how they felt about the way things were happening against them there. Now, as a consequence, Pope Pius XI aligned the International Catholic Church against Mexico, and simultaneously the Soviet Union opened its first embassy in the New World in Mexico City in 1924. Now, we're going to talk about that here in just a minute, because all of this comes about as a consequence of Lenin having sent Mr. Borodin back to the New World to organize North America, that is the U.S., then Mexico, and finally Cuba. And Lenin told him to do whatever had to be done to set up a bureau to organize all of Latin America for the Comintern. So I'm going to skip up to that period, skip through Mexican history proper to the injection of the Comintern, the Communist International, the Third International, into the politics of the New World. There's another book which is written by a woman that is certainly not one of us, and was published in 2011 by the University of Alabama Press, which nevertheless has full of a lot of information that was not hitherto available to most people, and I think it would be worth your while taking a look at it, called Stumbling Its Way Through Mexico, the Early Years of the Communist International, as I say, published in 2011 by a woman named Daniela Spencer. Enough said about that in terms of reference material. Now, let's go back to 1918. Lenin decided to send Borodin to the United States. Now, you'll recall that at the end of 1917, Borodin had been teaching school in Chicago. He goes back to Russia, and there he is recruited by Lenin into the Comintern Secret Service, and which, by the way, is run by Stalin. He becomes what I kind of think of as the first of the Comintern James Bond's agents. This is the kind of guy that when you got a problem someplace, you send him there, he'll take care of it. and in all kinds of inventive ways. So the first place he went on his way back to the New World was Chicago, and during 1918 he did what he could to put order into that mess up there where they had two competing communist parties and all kinds of personality problems, John Reed leading one of them. I'm not going to go into that. From there, he went to Mexico, which was his next assignment, and in October 4th, 1919, Borodin finally crosses the border into Mexico in the state of Tamaulipas at the border spot Nuevo Laredo, from Laredo, Texas. Now, there he's met by several different men who take him to Mexico City. These are men who want to become members of the Comintern. They want to form a party in Mexico that will be affiliated with the Communist International, which will be the official Communist International party in Mexico. That's why Borodin has come, is to get them set up. That is what will eventually lead up to the Elias government, the Plutarco Elias Calles government recognizing the Soviet Union in 1924, the work that they've been doing there. But more importantly, for our purposes at this moment, is to take a look at on October 19th, with his arrival in Mexico, the existing socialist groups there had an important formative congress. The first one was held in Mexico City, and it had the same, it was by those right-wing socialists who had the same political line as everybody Lenin had said was a traitor in Europe. Now, so immediately after that, on November 24th, the communists that Borodin had gathered around him met to form the Communist Party of Mexico. So its formation date is November 24th, 1919. And they selected a man named Jose Allen to be their leader. Now, Allen was given several tasks. First of all, to build the Communist Party of Mexico, of course. And the second was to form a bureau that would take charge of organizing the rest of Latin America for the Comintern. And they did. So from that time forward, you begin to see communist parties being kicked off all over Latin America. I go through the details of what Jose Allen did in Mexico in your book, and on page 13 of that chapter, of chapter 30, you'll see those details about what he was doing in Zacatecas and Pueblo. Now, among those people that had brought Borodin into Mexico City to begin with was a man from India named M.N. Roy, who was married to a woman named Evelyn Trent. Borodin decided that they would be the representatives to go to the Comintern's Second Congress in 1920. You'll remember that's the Congress that was being held at the time that the Red Army was moving on Warsaw. Now, Allen focused his major efforts on building a labor base in Mexico, but he decided to go about it in a somewhat different way. Mexico was by now organized by a bunch of AFL type of trade unionists, which means that they were acting essentially as a employment agency for the capitalists. If you got one of their union cards, and you were the kind of person that wouldn't be drunk on the job and that would get up and go to work, and you didn't mind working 12 to 16 hours a day, 16 days a week, that your union would get you a job, and you could keep that job for a long time. So they had a power base based upon acting as an employment agency. Now, what Borodin wants to do is to create a labor base that has an interest in overthrowing the capitalist system altogether and replacing it with a Bolshevik system of some kind or another, depending on what model they have in Russia at the moment. At any rate, that's what they did. Now, going back for a moment to the position of the Mexican bourgeoisie, the first of the post-Diaz presidents was a man named Francisco Madero, and he ruled from 1911 to 1913. He came from the fifth richest family in Mexico, so you can see that there wasn't a great deal of difference between him and Diaz in terms of class background. But on December 6th, there was an uprising against Diaz, which has led eventually in 1910, which led eventually to the overthrow of Diaz. The man that wrote the book demanding for his expulsion was named Madero, and he wrote a book called The Presidential Succession in 1908 because he saw what was happening, and this became the first document of the 1910 revolution. In 1913, Madero murdered Victoriano Huerta. Now, this was a conspiracy that was launched between U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane and Madero, and this was after the conspiracy that Lane had been involved in that put Huerta in power as military dictator to begin with. So there's two Huertas involved in all of this, and you don't want to confuse the fellow we'll know later as Adolfo de la Huerta, who became president later on. I wouldn't want to confuse him with Victoriano Huerta. I just mentioned that because these names are already getting to be too many for this lecture. You can find all of this in chapter 30 in great details, but the important thing here is that by 1913, 4 generals had emerged as the de facto bosses of Mexico: Pancho Villa in the north, Emiliano Zapata in the south, Carranza in Mexico City, and Alvaro Obregón. They were all anti-Huerta, and that was the only thing they had in common. So once they got rid of Huerta, they began to fall out among themselves. They got rid of Huerta in June of 1914 when Pancho Villa demonstrated that he could put 20,000 soldiers into the field at one point in Zacatecas, and there he destroyed Huerta's entire federal army. So Huerta was overthrown. He fled Mexico in April, and in the meanwhile, the U.S. sent troops to Veracruz, triggering the Second Mexican-U.S. War. The second horseman of this apocalypse was the mass peasant farmer leader from the state of Morales, which I mentioned to you before, named Emiliano Zapata. He was by far the most left-wing and revolutionarily progressive of the Great Four. He was tricked into a trap, and he was assassinated on August 19, 1919. In 1952, a movie was released called Viva Zapata, starring Marlon Brando, and I think it's still the best cinematic treatment of this particular event. At any rate, so that was the end of Zapata. Venustiano Carranza, the third horseman of import here, succeeded Huerta. He was president from 1917 to 1920. And finally, the fourth horseman, General Alvaro Obregón, assassinated Carranza on May 21, 1920, in Puebla. The bourgeoisie then had several contenders for state power to replace General Carranza, including Alvaro Obregón, a different one, Adolfo de la Huerta, General Sonora Governor, and Sonora Governor Plutarco Calles. Calles would win out over this, and he would become president after this dogfight in 1924. And he did it on the basis of, he was elected, and he did it on the basis of a cross-class alliance party, becoming the first president of the newly formed Mexican Party, which would eventually be called, it didn't have this name yet, but soon would have the name PRI, Party of the Institutional Revolution. And it would rule over Mexico for another 60 uninterrupted years. From June 1st through the end of November of 1920, Adolfo de la Huerta took the role of placeholder, and he was allowed to assume the presidency while the main contenders fought out that succession among themselves. Obregón, who was the fourth man, was loyal to Carranza until he decided to kill him in 1920, and then the populist leader, Plutarco Calles, won the election of 1924 and succeeded him. That's the succession of official presidents. But by this time, in 1920, by December 24, the Mexican Communist Party had been in existence since 1919, and it was carrying on its own work within Mexico, and it was also kicking off other communist parties all over Mexico. Now, the next generation of communists would feature Jose Allen, that is, following Baroden, as the leader of the Mexican Communist Party. Emin Roy and Evelyn Trent, as I say, would never come back to Mexico after their trip to the Second Congress of the Comintern. Roy was sent to the Far East, where he became a founder of the Communist Party of India. Another guy that was very influential and had met Baroden at the border and taken him to Mexico City was named Charles Phillips. an interesting fellow himself because he lived so long. He didn't die until 1989, and he was born in Mexico City. I'm sorry, born in New York City in 1895. At any rate, Phillips had left Mexico in 1919 with Borodin, and he had taken up assignment in Madrid, where he formed the Communist Party of Spain. And we talked about that a lot in Chapter 16. I'm not going to go through it here. But these are some of the key figures in this next generation of communists that are emerging in Latin America. Now, what the key thing that Jose Allen made in terms of strategy with regard to labor was the CROM, which was the AFL-Gompers type of union where they acted as an employment agency for Mexico and foreign capitalists. It was pretty well locked into a large number of workers who were just happy to have a job and didn't mind working these hours, and they were willing to undergo that kind of labor discipline, who were young enough that they could work hard so that the capitalists wanted them. They had a relationship with this union, which of course meant that they were paying their union bosses to get them the right kind of men and to assure labor peace. The last thing the CROM ever wanted was a strike, because there was nothing. That part of their whole deal was, we'll supply you with a stable labor force and you won't have to worry about a strike. We of course will require a certain amount of money to do that, a certain amount of money for them and a certain amount of money for us. The most egregious conditions facing Mexican workers at the moment were in the Mexican oil field. So here it was much easier to make the argument that you have to seize the means of production, seize the oil wells, seize the oil fields, make them their public property as your first step towards Soviet communism. And so the Communist Party was having a great deal of success with the labor unions in the oil field in Mexico. The die was cast in 1926 when the U.S. sent a new ambassador, Dwight Morrow, who was also the father-in-law of the famous reactionary Charles Lindbergh, who had flown across the Atlantic Ocean, came to an agreement with the radical Freemason president of Mexico, Plutarco Calles, that modified the previous year's oil law. The Calles government had gotten from the Mexican Congress, and this agreement provided much of what Calles wanted for Mexico and the oil field workers union, and it just barely avoided a third U.S.-Mexican war. So along the way, part of that agreement allowed workers in Mexico to organize, which meant that in the oil field, and that meant that the Communist Party was now legally organizing, not as likely to get killed for having its organizers out in the oil field working with police. Now, they're up against guys that don't have a lot of use for these kinds of agreements. One of them was Edmund Doheny, and a guy named Pierce out of California, who Doheny is pictured in that movie There Will Be Blood. So if you that's based on a book Upton Sinclair wrote called Oil. That was the name of the book, and it's a biography of Doheny, and this movie is kind of an elaboration of that book. So it's well worth watching to show you the kind of personality, as well as the cable drilling technology that they show there, of the kind of men that were working in Mexico. So the Achilles heel for Mexico had been the Porfirio Diaz mining law of 1864, which gave subsoil rights to whoever was living on the land that had title to the land. And of course, the only subsoil of interest for most people was oil. Now, all the foreigners had to do, as well as local capitalists, was to gain ownership of those from the cash-starved farmers for the land that they had, and they could proceed to drill on it. And that's why that movie Banditas, I think, is kind of interesting, to show you how they stole the land from the landholding peasants and then began to use it themselves. Now, in 1885, John D. Rockefeller was operating through Standard Oil, and he had paid off Porfirio Diaz for this oil law. He had created a subsidiary to handle Mexico called the Waters Pierce Oil Company, and he began importing oil from that subsidiary out of Veracruz into the United States, where it went into Standard's monopoly on North American distribution. Well, Rockefeller's partner and nominal owner of this company was Henry Pierce, and Pierce's partner was a guy from California named Edward Doheny. And as I say, you want to see a look into what Doheny was like, you want to see that movie, There Will Be Blood. At any rate, they had a great deal of success in Mexico. And in the state of Veracruz, they hit, which also borders on 8 other Mexican states. In 1901, Pierce and Doheny hit it really big in Veracruz, operating under the rubric of the Huasteca Petroleum Company. Now, this company produced oil there for the next 25 years until it was nationalized. Now, Huasteca is an area within 6 states occupied by the Huastec people, similar to the way the Kurds occupy today adjacent parts of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Iran. All right, what was the big well that they hit there? It was called Cerro Azul, near a place today called Poza Rica. Now, the greatest oil strike in the history of the world occurred here in Huasteca. When this well at Cerro Azul came in at 263,000 barrels a day. It was the largest production well in the world at that time and still is. I mean, it's not still producing at that level, but nobody has produced more than that from a single well since that time. So these were extremely powerful interests, and they had, in 1938, they almost got President Roosevelt to declare war on Mexico again. That would have triggered the third U.S.-Mexican War for another time. One other guy that was working in this area was named Wheatman Pearson. He paid Diaz and brought his British fortune to drill another well at Tampico in 1908. And then he split his British capitalist operations off from his Mexican capitalist operations, and he began surveying for oil in 1909. In 1910, he hit a well that came in at 100,000 barrels a day. This made him the second most important oil man, Pierce and Doheny having first place in Mexico. His Mexican interests were organized as the Compañía Mexicana de Petróleo Águila S.A. Pearson had extensive experience in Mexico, and Diaz had given him a contract to build the Grand Canal in Mexico City in 1889, and then in 1895 Diaz gave Pearson the contract to build all of the port and harbor facilities in Veracruz. I can tell you that many of them are still there today. The following year, Diaz gave Pearson the contract to build the Tehuantepec Railroad, which goes from the Tehuantepec Peninsula, where Mexico joins with Guatemala, across into Chiapas and Tabasco. While they were doing that, they reported oil seeps to Pearson that they had found in San Cristobal and Pedregal. Well, that, of course, Pearson was well aware of what Doheny and Pierce and the Rockefellers had pulled out of Cerro Azul and elsewhere in the Huasteca region, so well, he knew it was time to go for broke, and he knew who to bribe to get the permission to do it. And so these foreign oil companies didn't miss a stroke when Porfirio Diaz was overthrown in 1910. It didn't hurt them at all. There were too many people on the payrolls of Pierce, Doheny, and Pearson to even consider stopping oil production. And from the standpoint of the government, whatever kind of government it was, they needed the oil money as much as the previous guys had needed it. So they were quite willing to make a deal. By the time Pearson was fully invested down there, his interest alone accounted for 61.5% of all Mexican oil ownership, and standard supplier, Pierce and Doheny, accounted for 38.5%. So you can see that between these few men, they controlled almost all of the oil that was going out of Mexico. Now, the First World War resulted in the Americans sending 50,000 gasoline-fueled trucks and planes into Europe. Now, those planes all needed oil. They needed oil, they needed gasoline. So, in the last year of the war, these men, Rockefeller, Pearson, Doheny, accounted for 15.4% of global petroleum requirements, and the Mexican fields had risen to be 25.2% of that world oil supply. Now, you probably know by now about the Red Scare in the United States that followed immediately after the end of the First World War, and of course with the Russian Revolution in Russia. What this had done was to make men like Rockefeller, Pierce, Doheny, Pearson very nervous about their situation in Mexico, because the Mexican Communist Party had been formed in 1919, and it wanted all their land and all of their wells, and it was having considerable success. So these guys began to look around for an alternative to Mexican oil, and the place that they looked at first that was most successful for them was Venezuela. We're going to talk about Venezuela a couple lectures from now, in it's chapter 32 in next year's 2015 edition of ABCs. So now, back in Mexico, there was no thought given to conserving oil reserves at all. Now, and what this meant was that all of the natural gas, that is methane, that was coming out of every oil well was just flared, burned off, and completely wasted for decades. So natural gas had not yet become the important factor in world economics that it was about to become. But at any rate, in 1924, Mexico accounted for only 13.7% of global production, and by 1930, only 3%. So Pearson and his UK investor plan were willing to sell out to the North Americans, and they did sell out in 1927, so that the Rockefeller bunch bought everything they had, and now they had 77% of all the foreign ownership in Mexico, which is also the same as saying 70% of all of the ownership of oil, because there were no indigenous Mexican capitalists producing. Now, the worst thing that could happen was a price collapse on oil, which made the situation for the government, the new 1924 government, even more severe. And that meant that Cayce wanted a bigger cut than the government was getting from the Rockefeller bunch. In 1934, and there was a lot of struggling over that, by 1934, General Cardenas won the national elections rather easily. He'd been a general that had been loyal to the Cayce government, and who, when the Americans were threatening to intervene again to protect the Rockefeller oil field interests, it was Cardenas who had been sent by Cayce to burn the oil fields if it came to that. Wheatman was gone. He sold his Eagle Oil to Shell Oil. So the Dutch imperialists had replaced them as number 2 to the Standard Oil group. But again, these are all foreigners. And the biggest problem for whether it was Shell or the other big two was their ignorance of the Mexican situation. Instead of reaching an accommodation with labor, which would have been in their best interest, these companies began to demand more concessions from the Mexican government on taxes. Well, as you can see, Cayce wasn't happy with what he was getting anyway from the foreign companies, and now Cardenas was going to be even less happy. So now they begin to fight, because the Communist Party is putting forward the demand that the companies pay decent wages to their workers and higher tax revenues to the Mexican government, which puts them in the unusual position of being a Communist Party with control over a working class which wants support for a bourgeois government. Perhaps not the position they really would like to have had, but it's the position that they did have. And so that kind of struggle went on for quite a long time. Now, the British position in 1934 was that they still owned only 24% of the Mexican oil field. And it looked like to many people that if the Cardenas government was going to nationalize oil, or do something that was just as bad, insist that the companies pay higher taxes and higher wages, that this was going to lead to another war with the United States. The total investment of these companies in Mexico from 1900 to 1937 was estimated by the government at about $100 million. But for this investment, they had taken out between $1 billion and $5 billion for themselves, and taken it out of the country, which was the worst part of it, because if it had stayed inside the country, then at least it would have dribbled down through the rest of the economy. So this was not a situation that the government could tolerate forever, because it simply wasn't getting its fair share as far as it was concerned. Now, the struggle between the Mexicans and the companies came to a climax after 4 years of intense tit-for-tat battles and workers' strikes. The Cardenas government conducted the legal battle, and the Communist Party led the workers in the strike actions. So what happened is even more fascinating in the blow-by-blow, month-by-month history of these years, because here you have a strong Communist Party allied with a radical Freemason Catholic government, or anti-Catholic government, having complete success. David defeated Goliath and emerged as the leader of the new phenomenon on the world stage with the March 18th, 1938 nationalization of the entire Mexican oil field. This almost triggered the Third War, and it would have if it hadn't been for the fact that Roosevelt was looking at a very serious penetration of this hemisphere by the Germans and the Japanese, and he knew, because Roosevelt was a very well-educated man, even if he was an imperialist, he knew that the situation in Latin America was extremely unstable. There was a lot of anti-Yankee, anti-Gringo sentiment everywhere, and it wasn't going to take much to fire up in America. He wasn't about to pull that trigger easily. Let's go back and take a look at how this situation evolved in detail. Now, as the political consciousness of the Mexican oil field workers made leaps and bounds, it became possible for Jose Allen and his Communist Party to form the Sindicato Único de Trabajadores Petroleros. This became, and that was in December 35, and in a few years it would become the STPRM. In English, this is the Union of Oil Field Workers of the Mexican Republic. 1 month later, in 1906, the Communists took the PRM into a massive, newly created union of their creation called, in English, Committee for Proletarian Defense. The principal demand of this new organized labor force had gone well beyond simple wages and working conditions, and now was for immediate transfer of all of Mexico's oil fields into ownership by the nation. All foreign oil companies should be nationalized, which is to say, all the oil companies in Mexico. So within 2 years, this would come to pass. And this, that is in March 18th, 1938, and this, of course, would again put Mexico in position of going to war with the U.S. and Great Britain. How did the expropriation actually come down? Well, on March 18th, 1938, the government of President Lázaro Cárdenas expropriated the oil and gas holdings of foreign interests. Cárdenas was the first Latin American to carry out such a far-reaching action. Subsequently, there have been many. It was a milestone in Mexican history and in the history of the world. There had been a successful nationalization of few wells shortly before this in Bolivia, but Bolivia was, at this time, an extremely small-time producer. So other than a legal precedent, this didn't really mean much. Now, there were several factors that led to this expropriation. One was the constant labor unrest. The unions in the oil field were constantly going on strike for one reason or another. The other was the interference of the foreign oil companies in the internal life of Mexico, and the oil companies had naturally found politicians within the nation that they could buy off to represent them, and this caused internal problems. Much as you have in the Ukraine today, where the Americans have bought up a bunch of politicians that will do what they want them to do, and of course they have internal problems and a collapsing economy, and it isn't going to last forever. But at any rate, this is the kind of foreign intervention that the Mexican government didn't like. Furthermore, the Mexican government, these companies that controlled the entire Mexican oil industry, had refused to search for new resources or bring known resources online until they got what they wanted in terms of concessions from the union and lower taxes from the government. So they weren't doing the job that needed to be done if the government was to have more and more oil at its disposal. And the ability of the Mexican government to get away with the expropriation was, as I say, enhanced by the international situation, where the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, and soon Spain, were actively trying to subvert the U.S. in its own backyard, and the Soviet government was giving Mexico its full support. Mexico was already the strongest ally of the USSR, and it had provided much support to the Mexicans and to the Republicans of the Spanish Civil War, and they were shipping weapons, and the Russians at the time had some of the most advanced tanks and planes in the world, so the government was benefiting from Soviet assistance, which they were getting for next to nothing. Now, Mexico now had the technological and financial ability to produce all the oil it needed for domestic purposes and for export without any foreign assistance, if over all of the oil fields and all of the equipment in it. Now they had the profit motive too, because if they seized these oil fields, they wouldn't be talking about a percentage anymore of in terms that they would get in the form of taxes, they would get all of the oil revenue. And that is kind of equivalent to Stalin's situation when he recognized that what he needed was all of the agricultural revenue in the Soviet Union, not just the 10% the government had been getting in the early part of 1928, for example. So the choice was, we either let them screw us around like they've been doing indefinitely and put up with all of their crap, or we just take them over altogether, and then all of their oil, all of the revenue is ours. So they had a real profit motive now getting into this whole thing. And finally, the seizure of the oil fields would give Cardenas and his political party the massive support that so that the Calles party that Cardenas had inherited would become the permanent institution of the Mexican Revolution. And it did. So those were all reasons. Finally, Cardenas had a trump card. He could pull this off. He had a combat-trained, well-equipped army that was fully functional and extremely loyal. He had been an army general. He had been the one that Plutarchos Calles had sent to burn the oil fields when they thought the gringos were going to invade. So he had his army, he had loyal officers, and he had them in place. And if he said, we're going to seize the oil fields, within 24 hours the army would take about that. So Roosevelt had started the Mexican War. Now, what he do was pressure on it that way. So they were bitching that the United States should intervene and protect American property down there. As you can see, Roosevelt had all of these other considerations to take into account. He wasn't willing to do that, but he would give them certain things like the economic blockade. Many years later, when I met Mexicans who were wealthy Mexicans and who had lived through that period, one of them told me, a woman told me, that it was the only time in her life that she'd ever experienced hunger. Knowing that woman, I can't imagine what that hunger would have been, other than maybe some particular food that she wanted that she wasn't getting because it had to be imported. But at any rate, everybody in Mexico felt the blockade. But victorious in this war against the Catholic Church, Calles and Cardenas had moved to the far left. They had to defeat a right-wing coalition within Mexico, and the CTM had been taken over largely by the STPRM. The CTM was the Confederation of Mexican Workers now, and it was the broad AFL Gompers type of union. But the STPRM and its Communist Party had taken them over. Cardenas had what he called a 6-year plan, and they had thrown their support behind it. So with oil money, Cardenas now had the financial ability to make his 6-year plan work. Not content with that, the Communist Party turned its cadre loose to organizing the farmers in bulk. And they put them into an organization called the National Confederation of Farmers. In Spanish, the initials are CNC. Still the biggest single mass organization in Mexico today upon which the pre-government relies. We have a pre-government again, by the way. This new one under a man named Nieto is the most reactionary government Mexico has had since Porfirio Diaz. This guy is a total puppet of Washington, but his main job is to turn oil over, to get it out of government hands. My prediction is that that is not going to happen, but it's going to lead to a tremendous struggle within Mexico. And who knows how that revolution may develop, because it's another one where you have an indigenous Mexican capitalist class which is tied into oil field service production from those fields, and they're not going to want to give up that position easily. So if Nieto survives assassination, which is still a big question, because that's the normal way of resolving problems in Mexican oil field politics, there's still going to be some kind of civil war over this struggle over Pemex. We'll go back to that point later on. But the government made it clear that it was going to side with the unions and against the companies on this business about wages and working condition concessions. So the Communist Party pushed the class struggle into a completely new and different direction than it had gone before, and that the oil companies reacted violently as 1935 began. They tried to force Roosevelt to open the border to arms shipments to their mercenary thugs and their generals that they had bought off to oppose President Cardenas. The accusations flew back and forth between the companies and the government. Mexican people just held their breath because they didn't know what was going to happen, what the final solution to foreign ownership of Mexico's most important resources was going to be as it came to a head. The STPRM by this time had grown to 18,000 regular dues-paying members in 1936. The government made it clear which side it was on. And that side, from December 36 through May of 37, negotiations went on between the union and the companies, with the government taking the union side. In May of 37, the companies made a final offer of 14 million pesos to the STPRM for wages. The CTM pie cards would have liked to accept that, of course, but the Communist Party said no. Therefore, so did the STPRM, and in the end, so did the CTM. A final confrontation now was inevitable, and accordingly the confrontation began when President Cardenas informed the companies that unless they could reach agreement with the unions, and a general strike was now being organized, he would have to intervene in the oil fields and the refineries just to keep the economy going. And he said at any rate, and in any case, the companies were going to be required to increase the wages exactly as the union demanded. Round 2 of the title fight went to labor and the government. Or round 1, I should say. Round 2 began in June of 1937, when Cardenas declared a national emergency and the CTM agreed that labor would go back to work, call off the general strike, while the government decided how to handle the companies in round 2. The Cardenas government had taken the Federal Board of Conciliation and Arbitration as its mechanism, and it sent the companies an ultimatum in the form of an edict that required them to submit their books to compulsory arbitration via an audit, and 30 days had been given to the board to resolve the matter. So the matter shifted from one between the union and the companies, between the government and the companies. So that took the heat off of the STPRM for a moment. They'd done their part. Round 3 consisted of the publication of the audit report by the arbitrators, and it began by reviewing the history of the companies from day one of their appearance in Mexico, and it listed 40 conclusions. On each and every point, the interests of the government were shown to be at odds with the companies. This round completed with the board's ruling on the labor point, which was that the companies easily could and should pay the union's wage increase demands. The union demand was 26 million pesos, and the company's final offer had been only 14 million. Then, faced with this arbitration decision, they increased their offer literally at the last minute to 20 million pesos. Debate over the company's offers and the union's demands and the board's decision went on for 4 more months. But the handwriting was on the wall. The capitalists were just as blind to their probable loss of everything in Mexico as they had been in Russia before General Orzanikets liberated the oil fields of the Caucasus. Round 4 thus began with fighting over the board's orders, and it continued into 1938. But by the end of 1937, it was clear to the government that the edge the companies had had against President Calles of threatening war with the United States had considerably diminished. FDR had been openly touting his good neighbor policy up there in Washington, and the UK would probably not dare go to war with the US over an active intervention in Mexico. So General Cardenas believed his army could defeat the Brits in any case, and everyone knew that the president had the ability and willingness to burn the oil fields if it came to that. So at the end of 1937, round 4 ended with open hostilities. Round 5 began when Cardenas took back the leased lands to Standard Oil California in 1937. Now, SoCal had been, well, I won't go into its history, but at any rate, it had oil operations there. Of course, it was a Rockefeller property. It was, and at the end of 1937, Cardenas took it back and gave it to the nation on January 1st, 1938, as a New Year's gift. He then turned over the National Petroleum Administration, which was just an office, with what would become the embryo for the new government concern that we know as Petróleos Mexicanos, or Pemex, the Mexican Oilfield Service Company. So it was told to prepare and to move in and take over the job that the foreign oil companies' head offices had been doing before. Round 6, simultaneously Cardenas moved to seize Eagle Petroleum, as it was the weakest of the foreign-owned companies. That's the one that had been set up by Wheatman Pearson. And it had no chance of getting FDR to intervene on its behalf or on behalf of any British and Dutch owners. So Eagle agreed to the takeover, and Cardenas declared that the government had a right to and would take somewhere between 15% and 35% of the royalties, depending on circumstances that it would yet determine. The United Front of Foreign Capitalists had been broken, and the companies should have thrown in the towel, but they didn't. Instead, just before Christmas of '37, Eagle withdrew from its agreement, and the companies lined up together to stop production in the oil fields and the refineries. Well, that's about the worst thing they could have done. I think their fate was already sealed, but they were certainly helping it. The companies declared the Section 7 portion of the Board of Arbitration's report to be unfair and unduly influenced by a prejudiced government. Now, Cardenas had no choice but to surrender or go all the way, and he went all in. On round 7, the year 1938 began with the companies arming mercenary armies to fight the federal government in Mexico, and thus reignite the Civil War. The companies and their great banks attempted economic subversion of the Cardenas government by depleting Mexico's monetary reserves, intending to destabilize the peso. In his New Year message in 1938, the one where he had given the Standard Oil of California properties to the nation, Cardenas said the government would not yield to the companies, rather they would be forced to comply with the law, and furthermore, their future activities would be undertaken in the Mexican national interest in development. Unknown to the companies was that FDR had already decided that should, quote, these greedy bastards be too stupid to see the handwriting is on the wall, unquote, that he would leave them to flounder on their own. He would not send the Marines to Veracruz once again for a third Mexican War. The Council War. Okay, round 8. On March 10, 1938, Cardenas met with his old friends, the generals of the Army, told them what he was going to do. They backed him firmly. He asked them for a law, to draft the law nationalizing the foreign oil companies. That meant all the oil and oil-related service and refinery industries in Mexico. And remember this, it also means these generals will now have the opportunity to become the new owners of the oilfield service business. So they have a vested, substantial financial interest in being loyal to the nation and the president. That cannot be underestimated. Certainly not in Mexico. Round 9. Suddenly the court case, based on the company's lawsuit against the Board of Arbitration, moved to a decisive fate, when the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled in favor of the government. The companies were ordered to comply with the board's orders by 5 p.m. on the 15th of March, 1938. They did not, and the next day, March 16th, the STPRM, the Oilfield Workers Union that the Communist Party leads, went into court, and they asked the judges to declare the companies to be in a state of rebellion. The court granted the motion. The companies gave up, but it was too late. The knockout blow then came in round 10. President Cardenas signed the draft oil law that his generals had drawn up at 9:45 p.m. On the 18th of March of 1938, and at 10 p.m. he telegraphed his generals to take up combat positions and physically seize all properties everywhere of the oil companies. He specifically directed appropriate Army commanders to prepare to dynamite the oil wells and burn any oil fields in danger of being occupied by foreign troops, particularly if the U.S. invaded. It was all over. Now, in the aftermath, the STPRM trade unionists wanted to run the oil fields permanently. A conflict arose with the government. Cardenas wanted the government to run the oil fields because he said the nation has an interest now in oil, and not just the working class that produces it. And the Communist Party decided to side with the government. So when it did, it had the ability to force the STPRM into accepting the idea that there would be a state oil company. Again, this is the company that we now know as Petróleos Mexicanos, or Pemex. So 3 months after the nationalization, Cardenas announced the government would indeed form a national oil company, and it was done on June 7th. By this time, it was obvious that Washington was not going to intervene, and that neither the Dutch nor the British had the guts for this kind of a stupid move, and so the whole thing was over, except they're going to have to live through this period of blockade. The expropriated oil companies were they offered to pay them off for a period of years, that agreement was finally signed in Washington in 1941. And then they agreed to pay these Rockefeller, British, and Dutch interests a total of $165 million. But these payments were going to be they were going to be made in payments, and they were going to last until 1963. So, in other words, well over 20 years later before this whole thing would be satisfied. But Washington settled for that. First of all, it took the heat off of their concern about Latin America suddenly revolting against them and becoming susceptible to German and Japanese interests, which were working all over the Western Hemisphere to try to take advantage of the anti-gringo sentiment, trying to subvert the American relationship with Latin America, the North American relationship. At any rate, by 1940, Pemex had absorbed all of the oil-related bureaucratic institutions of the government. The number of insured jobs given workers had been increased overnight from 17,600 to 21,940. Now this went a long ways in satisfying all the basic trade union demands that the labor movement had immediately. It also began creating a tremendous infrastructure in oil field service, which became known as Pemex, and oil field distribution. For 20 years from 1938 to 1958, Pemex grew steadily, but without a great deal of fanfare. It concentrated on internal markets, it provided funds to the federal budget in a steady and reliable way, and of course to all of the corrupt officials that were running Pemex and the government. Necessarily, it closely followed the policies of Mexico's presidents. During this period, Manuel Ávila Camacho, 1940 to 46, Miguel Alemán, 46 to 52, Ruiz Cortines, 58, and allowed Pemex to continue, these three presidents did, under one director general, a guy named Antonio J. Bermudez. Daily production under Bermudez had increased from 135,000 barrels per day to 275,000 barrels per day. Exploration continued steadily throughout the country, so even though Mexico was still a net importer, under the presidential administrations of López Mateos and Díaz Ordaz, that is from 58 to 64, 64 to 70, imports were subject to substitution wherever and whenever possible, and Mexico became an oil exporter. It was during these administrations that the U.S. once again began to exert powerful influence over the Mexican government. I used the International Monetary Fund and its CIA front organization called the Inter-American Development Bank to bribe the government and its officials in legal and illegal ways. Mexican focus on improving social conditions began to rapidly decrease. Even so, it would take decades for the great North American families through these financial institutions to complete their takeover of Mexican finance. And Pemex continued as the prime financier of what public sector social action and national industrialization there was. From 1984 to 74, Pemex production rose from 101,000 barrels to 238,000 barrels per day, and this was a source of income that the North American ruling families and their banks could not stop. Furthermore, for the first time, natural gas began to come online, and for commercial purposes, so that you wouldn't have to flare it all the time. Over these years, Pemex shifted its focus in production from northeast Mexico and Tamaulipas to the massive fields discovered onshore and offshore in the state of Tabasco, of which Villahermosa is now the oil capital, and where I went for my second major sojourn in Mexico 20 years after my first, which we're going to talk about here pretty quick. Well, by 1939, the Communist Party had become a leading force within the nation, and it had the great respect among a broad spectrum of classes. And its own intervention in the Spanish Civil War on behalf of the anti-fascist republic had produced a great soldier hero named David Alfaro Siqueiros. And that is where we're going to break this particular tape at this moment, because I want to go back here and talk a little bit about what was happening in the Communist Party itself besides the oil field. Okay, the party's we have just taken a look at what the Communist Party did in Mexico in terms of its organization, how it got started in the labor movement, how Rodin got it started, how it subsequently organized certain key areas in the labor movement, but the most important of which was the STPRM, the Oilfield Workers Union, and with that, it fought its way into a total nationalization of Mexican oil. Now, in addition to that, what else was the Communist Party doing? Well, Baronin had left it another task. That was to form an international bureau. And that bureau was going to organize parties everywhere else. As soon as Baronin left Mexico, he went to Cuba. He was in the Havana harbor about 6 hours. And there he was able to do one last thing, and that was to meet with Cubans who were, like the Mexicans that had met him in Tamaulipas and taken him to Mexico City. These were Cubans who wanted to form a Cuban Communist Party, and they wanted it to have official Comintern recognition.